All right. Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to welcome you, brothers and sisters, family members, friends. It is a weekly pleasure for me to have a chance to interact with you all and for us to expand our friendships and understandings, particularly about the Book of Mormon. I do want to get a plug in for next Sunday afternoon from 1 until 2. We'll have our annual Zoomathon, which is a fundraiser for kids in Haiti, conducted through Outreach International. And because it's Outreach International, 100% of the funds raised will actually go to Haiti. And since for white people to go to Haiti now puts them in serious jeopardy for kidnapping, to have people on the ground there that are involved in, I think there's 63 schools that Outreach is sponsoring. And so the people they have as caretakers and sponsors and teachers there are the ones that will handle the money. And so they can put it on where the needs are most significant. But since they had another earthquake and another serious set of floods, since the COVID problem is an epidemic there, and since they've also had the assassination of their president in the last couple of months, the situation in Haiti is most precarious, and they really do need help. And so for us to be able to raise the goal of $12,000 to provide for enough to be able to build or repair a new school, to provide for a teacher and provide for school lunch for a bunch of kids. This is the kind of investment that we've been making now for nearly 30 years. And we would like to invite all of you to join us on that enterprise through Outreach International next week. We'll be sending out the link tomorrow or the next day when Robert sends out his regular email, or you can contact me or you can just simply go directly to Outreach International if you'd like. In terms of the preliminary notes this evening, I do want to highlight that next week we have the review of the previous 8 sessions, and that will take us back to Jonathan Neville's presentation on Jonathan Edwards. It'll bring up Spencer McBride and Joseph Smith's campaign for president, Larry Stowe, Logos and the Lamp, Jerry Grover, illuminating the birth of Christ, Adrian Larson, the stick of Joseph, Brian Stubbs had 2 sessions on the Uto-Aztecan cognates related to the Semitic cognates, showing remarkable linguistic ties of the Book of Mormon in modern Ute and Aztec languages to those of the Hebrews, of the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. And then, of course, our guest tonight, our speaker tonight, Whitney Hornig. Whitney, let me go to the screen sharing and bring her introduction up. Presuming I've got the share working. Now then, hopefully you are seeing the Whitney Hornig slide.
We have it.
Whitney is a BYU graduate with a degree in family science. She works as an advisor in high school, helping students develop a life plan. She has amazing family history to the early development of the LDS movement in both the 6th and 7th generations of her line that are Mormons. Her maternal grandmother's father paid a post-mortem visit to one of his family members to say the Book of Mormon is true. Her parents felt, or that is Whitney's parents, felt that she had lost her testimony of the faith with her research into its history, and that research into the history brought her to the ghost of eternal polygamy. And that has motivated her research. And so this evening we gain the benefit of her research, and I invite and encourage you to embrace her effort to inform. For as her husband Vern has said, the world needs this book. Would you join me in prayer? Source of all good news, the photons and the atoms can tell. Source of the good news of eternal life, presented in your Son and in his gospel. Source of the promises, the covenants, the hope-inspiring words we seek to better know. source of beauty in unexpected places, in mineral, in assorted ugly people, the double rainbow. We gather this evening on Zoom to share a presentation by Whitney Hornig on the prophet Joseph Smith, and ask your blessing on her, on all of us, as we seek to balance teachings of the Book of Mormon with our varied histories forthwith. We thank you for her courage to delve into significant mystery, to share her journey, helping to clarify some mysteries in our history. For we read of virtue, monogamous marriages, forthright relationships built upon the truth. And we want to relay the best we can to our children in their youth. We recognize your openness to us, your compassion, your willingness to forgive, that we can claim your promises, your eternal gifts now and in life yet to live. So we thank you for this evening, part of the process we call life, and for the gospel plan to steer us through our difficulties and strife. We thank you for this day, this gathering, the beautiful message to instruct, if not to compel, to listen to your word, your whispers, your promises, your good news, that our lives might all fare well. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Whitney, the floor is yours. I will stop the stop share, and that should make it so you can begin.
All right. So, was this the one? Is this a screen you wanted? Or should I do this one and then you don't see all the video in the way?
Well, we're seeing you on the screen.
I'll just do this one and then we'll make it.
There you go. You're getting closer. There it is.
Better. So that
Mormon perspectives.
okay, perfect.
That's it.
All right. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this evening. I really enjoyed last week's meeting and just feeling of all of your spirit, and just it's so wonderful to gather with so many people who believe in the Book of Mormon. It has been a great source of comfort and guidance to me in my life. All right, so onward with this presentation. Okay, it's not working. Just a minute. There we go. Okay, so just a little, I know Paul introduced me, but just a little quick. So I am a 6th and 7th generation Mormon. For my family, all of my branches of the family followed Brigham Young west to Utah and became members of the Latter-day Saint Church based in Salt Lake City, Utah. My husband's family actually split. He had one main family in Nauvoo, and they actually split, and his ancestor came to Salt Lake City, Utah, but all of that ancestor's siblings ended up becoming members of the RLDS church. And so that's kind of neat. We have some letters for them back and forth, both trying to convince each other which church to be part of. And so that's kind of a fun, neat heritage of ours. I am a wife, mother, and grandmother. And I've had a deep love and respect for the Savior, Jesus Christ, the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, since I was a small child. So just really quickly, why I wrote this book. When my husband was bishop a few years ago of the LDS ward in Utah, our oldest were just going to be teenagers, and that's kind of what the LDS church termed the Google apostasy, was really kind of picking up, and people were finding out that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. They were calling him a pedophile, a predator, a hypocrite, and were leaving the church. And in a lot of instances, they were also leaving behind a belief in God. And so whether the LDS Church likes to admit it or not, they still are a polygamous church. They do not practice it with the living, but they do practice it for the dead. And so particularly if a man has been married more than once and those spouses have died, he is sealed in what they consider an eternal marriage to both of those spouses, or more than two, depending on how many. We had a neighbor once who had 3 wives had passed away, and he was on wife number 4, and he would get up in church quite often and tell us that he was a polygamist and all of his wives were in heaven. So that did cause me quite a great deal of anxiety. It was also taught to us that if we were qualified after this life to inherit the celestial kingdom, that there would be more righteous women there than men. And so our husbands would be required to take on more than one wife at that time. So for me, since the time I was a small child, that has caused me some anxiety. And then when I got married, I have been very blessed to marry just an amazing man, and definitely do not want to share him with anyone. So those things causing me some stress and anxiety. And then I'm a great student of church history. I love to read church history. And it started really bothering me how often Joseph spoke out against polygamy. And then I was told, and it is in the LDS church history, that that's because he was secretly practicing it. And so, the world wasn't ready for it yet. So he had to, he was a liar. He had to lie for the Lord. So a few years ago, I actually had the thought, and I'll change the slide here. Well, first of all, just really quick, what do other people say about Joseph Smith? Many of the churches founded on Joseph's original restoration movement, all the way to Catholics, Baptists, evangelicals, Protestants, non-denominational, even atheists, claim that Joseph taught or practiced polygamy. And it's my belief, after my research, that those who claim Joseph Smith taught and practiced polygamy base their statements on an incorrect and false history that began almost 200 years ago and has continued to be perpetuated to our day. So just really quick, here's a few things of what a few religious institutions say about Joseph today on their websites today. So Southern Baptists say that he received many revelations from God, that one of those was polygamy, a practice that Smith denied publicly but practiced secretly. That doctrine was an obvious downfall of Joseph Smith, and he was killed in 1844 as a result of the polygamy controversy. Emma, Joseph's wife, had been suspecting Joseph of having affairs with other women, i.e. Fanny Alger, about 1831, and from then on. Family life was not very happy and calm. Joseph was relating this to his brother Hiram and William Clayton. Hiram suggested that Joseph would write a revelation where God gives instructions for Joseph to have other wives. So that is what is on the Southern Baptist website about Joseph. The Catholic website says when Joseph was about 15, he began to experience some mysterious visions of his own. The Latter-day Prophet founded his Mormonry in 1830 at Fayette, New York, with 6 followers. Still another revelation was given to the Mormon prophet, by which he was commissioned to introduce polygamy into his church. Thereafter, the Latter-day Saint took to himself some 20 wives. So this is what the Community of Christ website says, and they are formerly known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their history on their website says Joseph Smith Jr. was the founder of our movement. The guidance he received in the Grove began a lifelong journey with God that brought both exhilarating joy and heartache to Joseph and his family. Joseph's personal experience with God did not end when he left the Grove that spring day. He continued to have significant spiritual experiences, one of which led to the Book of Mormon. As new theologies and practices were introduced to the church in Nauvoo, Many people were shocked and alarmed. When some members challenged these practices in a local newspaper, Joseph called on the Nauvoo sheriff and his deputies to destroy the printing press. Joseph was arrested on charges of treason. While awaiting trial in the town of Carthage, a mob stormed the jail and killed Joseph and his brother Hiram. Following the death of Joseph Smith Jr., the church was left without a clear leader. Over the next 16 years, our movement fractured into numerous factions under various leaders. Polygamy continued to be an especially divisive issue for many of the diverging factions. Those church members who opposed polygamous practices found themselves scattered across the Midwest without a leader or an organized church. And just as a side note, growing up, I was always told that the RLDS and then Community of Christ denounced polygamy and also claimed Joseph's innocence in that regard. About 2 summers ago, I was at an event called Sunstone here in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I met one of the Community of Christ apostles. I cannot remember his name. I can see his face, but can't remember his name. And he and I got into a discussion about Joseph Smith and polygamy. And he kind of started laughing a little bit. And he said, you know, I find it so interesting that our church is beginning to believe Joseph did practice polygamy. And I'm meeting more and more LDS members who are beginning to believe he didn't. So I thought that was very interesting. And then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, based out of Salt Lake City, Utah, this is what they say. By revelation, the Lord commanded Joseph Smith to institute the practice of plural marriage among church members in the early 1840s. The revelation on marriage stated general principles. It did not explain how to implement plural marriage in all its particulars. In Nauvoo, Joseph Smith married additional wives and authorized other Latter-day Saints to practice plural marriage. The practice was introduced carefully and incrementally, and participants vowed to keep their participation confidential, anticipating a time when husbands and wives could acknowledge one another publicly. So as I see it today, after doing a lot of research, I see there are 3 choices. The first choice is the LDS Church in Utah, that their history is correct. Joseph secretly practiced and taught a few select men about polygamy while speaking against it publicly. The second choice is that the RLDS church history is correct. Joseph never practiced polygamy and had only one wife, Emma. Furthermore, he never performed sealings of any kind. The third option that I see is that there is some truth in both the LDS and RLDS viewpoints. Joseph did perform sealings of some type, but they had nothing to do with polygamy. If Joseph secretly taught and practiced polygamy, polyandry, or even pedophilia, because one of his purported wives was only 14 years old, then according to the Lord's standards, as contained in the scriptures, Joseph was an adulterer, a hypocrite, a liar, and a sexual deviant. If, however, Joseph was innocent of these charges and instead was a faithful, chaste, virtuous, monogamous man who spoke out against polygamy because it was a crime and a sin, then he was the subject of a great conspiracy perpetuated by men who he called friends. I believe that the men who falsely claimed that Joseph practiced polygamy were in truth placing the blame of their own sexual deviancies upon his shoulders in order to further their own agendas. And now I'm going to go into my reasons why I believe that. Knowledge is powerful, and it is worth the effort to discover truth. Many people who speak out derisively of Joseph, I believe they do so ignorantly. They base their beliefs on a history built on questionable sources. Just as a side note, none of those sources are contemporary with Joseph. So if you go to contemporary sources that were created while he was alive, there are none that say he was a polygamist. All the sources that say he did polygamy, minus John Bennett, are after his death. John Bennett is the only one who actually wrote things while Joseph was alive to say he was a polygamist. So many people who claim to believe in Joseph have discarded, contradicted, or ignored his teachings, especially ascension theology and the establishment of Zion. Joseph loved, honored, and served the Lord. Great was the man Joseph, but few recognize and acknowledge him as God's servant. Joseph was a true messenger sent from the very presence of God with a message of restoration and redemption. The fruits which were produced by him are consistent with the Bible and other inspired texts. There is an abundance of evidence available to us today that absolves Joseph from any responsibility or connection to the abomination that was and is polygamy. He was a man who should be respected and appreciated for the great work he undertook in an attempt to bring a hard-hearted and stiff-necked people back into the presence of God. I ask you to seriously consider Joseph's history and his own words. Take a glimpse into his heart. As you explore this narrative, you may be surprised by what you find. You may even discover truth. So the first thing I want to start with is, what does God and the Bible say about marriage? Because this is important, as we'll talk about a little later. So the Bible starts off, and these references from the Bible are from Joseph's Holy Inspired Version. And you can find that online at centerplace.org if you don't own your own copy. So Genesis 1, 29 through 30 and 2:30 says, "And I, God, created man in my own image. In the image of my only begotten created I him. Male and female, one male, created I them. And I, God, blessed them." And that's reference to marrying them in a ceremony. "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." So men and women are created in God's image, and we are to be married, and we're to leave our father and mother and cleave to each other and become one. So after the creation, marriage was the first ordinance. God created Adam, and since it is not good that man should be alone, God created an helpmeet for him, and she was called Eve. She was the allegory of the creation states that Eve was created out of Adam's rib. And that is very important, because to be created out of the rib is to teach us, or to give us the understanding that a man and a wife are to walk side by side with each other, not one in front of the other, not one on top, not one crushing the other one, but together side by side is how God intends for us to walk through this life together. And Genesis 4:3 tells us that from that time forth, the sons and daughters of Adam began to divide 2 and 2 in the land. One man, one woman, 2 and 2 in the land. Genesis 5 tells us the first time polygamy is mentioned in the Bible is when the wicked Lamech, who is several generations after Adam, took unto himself 2 wives. The Lord tells us that Lamech's works were abominations and began to spread among all the sons of men. In Matthew 5:30, Christ tells us, "But I say unto you that whoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart." And then in 1 Corinthians, we learn, "Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God." So to me, that's important, because that Holy Inspired Version was done by Joseph Smith. So it tells you right there what was in his heart. So then what does God, Joseph Smith, and the Book of Mormon say about marriage? To me, this is important because Joseph revealed the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the books of Abraham and Moses. So if those books say something about marriage, then that is what Joseph believed about it also. So the very first book, so the Book of Mormon starts by saying the first book of Nephi, his reign and ministry, an account of Lehi and his wife Sarai. So one wife. Then Nephi makes a point of saying, and it came to pass that I, Nephi, took one of the daughters of Ishmael to wife. And we'll talk about Jacob's sermon in the next slide. On Mosiah 11, it's the first time, so the first time we hear about polygamy is Jacob's sermon. But the next time we hear about it is in Mosiah with King Noah, who did not walk in the ways of his father. For behold, he did not keep the commandments of God, but he did walk after the desires of his own heart. And he had many wives and concubines, and he did cause his people to commit sin and do that which was abominable in the sight of the Lord. Yea, and they did commit whoredoms and all manner of wickedness. So just really quick, I know that it's often defined, the word concubine is often defined as a woman of lower birth that is married to a man. So actually, so that is one of the definitions, but the most common definition at the time Joseph was translating the Book of Mormon, the most common definition for concubine was a woman who cohabits with a man without the authority of a legal marriage. So anywhere where polygamy is a crime and it is not legal to have more than one living wife, then any of the other women would be considered a concubine by the definition of Webster's 1828 dictionary, which was what Joseph would have been familiar with. 3 Nephi 12:28 is when Christ has come to the Americas, and he says to the people, he reiterates what he had said to the people in the Jerusalem. I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already in his heart. And then in Ether 10:5, we learn about a man named Riplakish. And it says, Riplakish did not do that which was right in the sight of the Lord, for he did have many wives and concubines. So now let's go talk about Jacob's sermon, because if those passages weren't enough to convince you that the Book of Mormon is an anti-polygamy book and a pro-monogamy, then we will go to Jacob's sermon, because it could not be more clear. So Jacob's been talking to his people. He's been talking to them about pride, covetousness, some of those things. And then he says, I must speak unto you concerning a grosser crime. So he calls it a crime, and he calls it a grosser one, and he talks that they're committing whoredoms because of the things which are written concerning David and Solomon. David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. So the people were justifying going into polygamy based on David and Solomon. And so the Lord is saying, and this sermon is a thus saith the Lord. So Jacob had said, I must speak unto you concerning grosser crime, thus saith the Lord. So this whole next section is from the Lord. It is a revelation from the Lord to Jacob, who was their priest and prophet at the time. So then the Lord reminds the people that he wanted to raise up a righteous branch from the loins of Joseph. And so that is why he brought them out of Jerusalem. And then he said, I gave you a commandment. There shall not any man among you have save it be one wife, and concubines he shall have none. So end of question, one wife, no concubines, no plural marriage. So then he says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, if I will raise up seed unto me, I will command my people. So this is where the LDS church in Utah, my whole life, and even now today, they would tell you, this is like the polygamy loophole. That if God can command you to enter into polygamy, to raise up seed, and they define raising up seed as having a lot of children. Well, that is a misunderstanding of this scripture. When the Lord talks about raising up seed, and look at the before when he says, raise up unto me a righteous branch, think of the allegory of the olive trees, the vineyard, where the Lord is trying to get a righteous branch. And so he's taking the people and he's putting them in the nethermost parts of his vineyard, and he's dunging them and he's pruning them and he's trying to raise up a righteous seed. So raising up seed unto the Lord, what he's saying there, I will command my people, he is saying, I will give you commandments. And this whole thing about one wife is a commandment. And that commandment is going to help you if you and your spouse, one man, one woman, can become one. They can, in their unity and in their love for the Lord, they can raise up to him and ascend to the Lord. So that is what raise up seed is. It is to actually literally rise up to the Lord. So then the Lord reminds the people through Jacob, these commandments were given to your father Lehi. And he says, you've known these before. And because of that, you are now coming under great condemnation because you have done these things which ye ought not to have done. Behold, ye have done greater iniquity than the Lamanites. You have broken the hearts of your tender wives and lost the confidence of your children because of your bad examples before them. And then he goes on and says, the Lamanites, which are not filthy like unto you, behold, the Lamanites are more righteous than you. For they have not forgotten the commandment of the Lord, which was given unto our father, that they should have save it were one wife, and concubines they should have none. So he's now said it again. Like, if we need to be clear here, people, I'm going to tell you again. And there should not be whoredoms committed among them. And now this commandment, this is a commandment, one wife, no concubines. This commandment they observe to keep. Wherefore, because of this observance in keeping this commandment, the Lord God will not destroy them, but will be merciful unto them. And one day they shall become a blessed people. And then Jacob ends by saying, now I, Jacob, spake many more things unto the people of Nephi, warning them against fornication and lasciviousness of every kind of sin. So there's Jacob for you. So now we go to the Doctrine and Covenants, because these are all revelations given to Joseph. So D&C 42, you shall love your wife with all your heart, cleave to her and none else. He that looks on a woman to lust after her shall deny the faith, shall not have the Spirit, and if he repent not, he shall be cast out. D&C 49, again I say unto you that whoever forbids to marry is not ordained of God, for marriage is ordained of God unto man. Wherefore it is lawful that he should have one wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. D&C 63, and verily I say unto you, as I have said before, he that looks on a woman to lust after her, or if any shall commit adultery in their hearts, they shall not have the Spirit, but shall deny the faith and shall fear. So in 1835, there was a committee formed to create their first Doctrine and Covenants. And Joseph Smith was on that committee, and we have no record of whether or not he actually assigned Oliver Cowdery to write what became Section 101 or the Statement or Law on Marriage, or if Oliver just wrote it. But Joseph did sanction it. The people voted unanimously to accept it. And Joseph actually quoted from it several times in the Times and Seasons and referred back to it. And he was putting it in the 1844 Doctrine and Covenants. It was removed under Brigham Young's order in 1876 and replaced with Section 132, which sanctions polygamy. So that's just something interesting to know. So the Statement or Law on Marriage says, according to the custom of all civilized nations, marriage is regulated by laws and ceremonies. Therefore, we believe that all marriages in this Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints should be solemnized in a public meeting or feast prepared for that purpose. All legal contracts of marriage made before a person is baptized in this church should be held sacred and fulfilled. Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again. So what does the Book of Abraham say about marriage? On the Book of Abraham, now this to me is very interesting also. It was revealed, translated primarily in November of 1835, but the people would never donate enough money to get it published into a book form. So Joseph began publishing it in installments in the Times and Seasons from March 1st to May 16th, 1842. This is significant to me because 1842 is the time period when the Utah-based LDS Church claims that Joseph began secretly teaching and practicing polygamy. So to me, it's interesting that Joseph publishes another bit of scripture that again talks about man having one wife and cleaving unto his one wife only and to become one flesh. So Joseph, Emma, and Hiram all fought the crime of polygamy, and that is what Joseph called it. He called it a crime. Joseph said in April of 1844, I had not been married scarcely 5 minutes and made one proclamation of the gospel before it was reported that I had 7 wives. In the Elders Journal, July 1838, edition 43, Joseph was the editor, and he listed a group of frequently asked questions. And he said, when we travel around and the elders travel around preaching, here's frequently asked questions, and then here's the answers. So one of those frequently asked questions was, do the Mormons believe in having more wives than one? Joseph's answer, no, not at the same time, but they believe that if their companion dies, they have a right to marry again. On March 17th, 1842, one of the main reasons that Joseph and Emma founded the Nauvoo Female Relief Society was, quote, to assist by correcting the morals and strengthening the virtues of the female community. At that time, that's just about when John C. Bennett's escapades start getting pretty obvious. And that is one of the reasons Joseph and Emma founded the Relief Society, was to get the women to be more morally pure and virtuous. And Joseph often spoke to the women. And one of the talks he gave to them, he told them to stop believing men who claimed that they could practice polygamy with them. And he said, even if they come to you saying the prophets told them to do it, you kick them out and you don't believe them. So he very much spoke against polygamy, publicly, privately, in sermons, in Times and Seasons, in the Relief Society. So in the October 1st, 1842 edition of the Times and Seasons, Joseph printed an affidavit titled On Marriage, declaring the law of the church, emphasizing that a man is to have only one wife, and he had it signed by leading citizens of Nauvoo. In March 1844, Hiram was accused of practicing polygamy by a man named Bostwick. And so Emma and Joseph were pretty upset that Hiram's name was dragged into the mud. And so they directed William W. Phelps to write a pamphlet titled A Voice of Innocence from Nauvoo. And Emma helped edit it. And then after it was done, they read it to the saints, who unanimously voted to live by its principles. It was unanimously accepted by 4 separate gatherings of the Relief Society. And it stated in part, we raise our voices and hands against John C. Bennett's spiritual wife system as a grand scheme of profligates to seduce women, and they that harp upon it wish to make it popular for the convenience of their own cupidity. Wherefore, while the marriage bed undefiled is honorable, let polygamy, bigamy, fornication, adultery, and prostitution be frowned out of the hearts of honest men. So, and then just another little side note. So we often in the LDS Church, we credit John C. Bennett with coining the term spiritual wifery, but it actually was a common term in America and in England at that time. Unknown to maybe us today, in the history of America, polygamy became associated with religious reform, and there were a lot of polygamous groups. Even way back into Martin Luther's day, 500 years ago, Martin Luther himself, his church obviously didn't enter into polygamy, but there were a lot of religious reformers during his time that did enter into polygamy. And then again, when Joseph Smith is restoring the gospel, again, a lot of pretenders, a lot of other religious reformists kind of sprung up, and a lot of them did start entering into polygamy. And so spiritual wifery was a term that a lot of people used, and the saints in Nauvoo used it, and Brigham Young's branch used that term for dozens of years here in Utah. So the term basically just means if you have a living wife and you take a second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever number wife, you could not legally be married to her, and so you were married in spirit. And so that's the term spiritual wife. So in June 12th of 1841, Hiram Smith wrote a letter to the saints, and he, at your church history, he was called to be co-president and co-prophet with Joseph in January of 1841. So in June, he is writing this as a co-prophet and co-president. The reason behind writing this letter was, and he says it here, is that saints, men and women, had been gathering with the saints in Nauvoo and leaving behind wives and children, or husbands and children, and coming and joining with the saints. A lot of times they were doing that because their spouse was not a believer, and so they were leaving the non-believing spouse and coming and joining the believers in Nauvoo. And then they were getting remarried once they were here. So they had a living spouse, maybe back east or back in England, and then were marrying again in Nauvoo. Anybody who gets a hold of the book by Dinger on the Nauvoo City and Nauvoo High Council minutes, the Nauvoo High Council minutes are filled. Almost every meeting was dealing with this situation of a man and a woman, with one or both of them having living spouses living elsewhere. And in each case, they were charged with adultery. And so Hiram writes this letter trying to stop the practice. So then he tells them, don't leave your spouse because they're an unbeliever, because you never know that the unbelieving spouse may be sanctified by the believing spouse. And then he says, behold, this is a wicked generation full of lyings and deceit and craftiness, and the children of the wicked are wiser than the children of light. They are more crafty, and it seems that it has been the case in all ages of the world. And the man, when he leaves his wife and travels to a foreign nation, while on his way, darkness overpowers his mind, and Satan deceives him and flatters him with the graces of the harlot. And before he is aware, he is disgraced forever. And greater is the danger for the woman that leaves her husband. And there are several instances where women have left their husbands and come to this place. And in a few weeks or months, they have found themselves new husbands, and they are living in adultery, and we are obliged to cut them off from the church. All right, so Joseph, John Bennett's escapades become publicly aware. So Joseph cuts him off from the church. And he gets printed up in the Times and Seasons. Their first notice was just a small little notice. Well, John Bennett did not go quietly. He fought back, became very bitter and angry towards Joseph, and started claiming that all of the things he had been doing, that Joseph actually had been doing them and teaching them to him. And so Joseph goes to a lot of leading citizens of Nauvoo, and he puts together an affidavit and certificate to disprove the statements contained in John C. Bennett's letters. And he gets the group of elders, they get a little over 300 of them, they gather together. Hiram speaks to them about their mission, and their mission is to take this pamphlet, this one-page affidavit, that printed it pretty large, and they were to canvass the entire United States to disprove Bennett's claims and to prove that Joseph was an innocent man who was a monogamist. And so I find this very fascinating. You can find this online, and some people who had an old copy of it have digitized it and put it online. And it's very fascinating to me that even in August 1842, Joseph is fighting the crime of polygamy and trying to clear his good name. So then, so this kind of the smoking gun, you might want to say, for Brigham Young's LDS Church is what they have, what they put into their Doctrine and Covenants in 1876 when they took out the law of marriage. They put in a section that is numbered 132 and is considered the polygamy revelation. So I'm going to just talk about it from Joseph's perspective. So Joseph inquired of God regarding the passage in the Bible, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. So he was praying and inquiring to God about that and trying to understand what that meant. Sometime in the spring of 1843, and we don't have an exact date of when this happened, but he did start beginning to teach people these concepts about that time. So it was about that time he received an answer, and then it was possible that it was written down around July 12th, 1843, most likely as he was preparing for a sermon that he delivered on July 16th of 1843. So in that sermon, he said, "No man can obtain an eternal blessing unless the contract or covenant be made in view of eternity. All contracts in view of this life only terminate with this life. Those who keep no eternal law in this life or make no eternal contract are single and alone in the eternal world and are only made angels to minister to those who shall be heirs of salvation, never becoming sons of God, having never kept the law of God." Essentially, what Joseph was teaching was that a man and his wife must be married in view of eternity in this life, or he will have no claim on her in the next, and they must remain as angels in heaven. Hiram read the revelation to the Nauvoo High Council in August of 1843. From the moment it was taught and read to the saints, those who were already secretly involved in polygamy twisted it into a revelation on polygamy. When a corrupted, doctored, edited version of it appeared in the Nauvoo Expositor in June of 1844, both Joseph and Hiram testified before the Nauvoo City Council that that was not the revelation Joseph had received. The revelation disappeared soon after Joseph had it written down, and it did not surface again until 1852 when Brigham Young brought it out of his locked desk and presented it at the General Conference, where he introduced polygamy to the entire Utah-based LDS Church. Thorough research into the LDS version exposes it as a fraudulent copy of a copy. Many witnesses who had seen and heard the original revelation testified at that time that Brigham's version was much longer and did not match the original. Brigham had it placed in the D&C in 1876 and replaced the law on marriage. Joseph and Hiram's testimonies before the Nauvoo City Council. This is what they said. This is what the minutes said they said. So June 8th, 1844, Hiram referred to the revelation read to the High Council, that it was an answer to a question concerning things which transpired in former days and had no reference to the present time. June 10th, 1844, Joseph the mayor said, they, meaning the Nauvoo expositor people, they make it a criminality for a man to have a wife on the earth while he has one in heaven, according to the keys of the holy priesthood. And the mayor read the statement of William Law in the expositor, where the truth of God was transformed into a lie. He read the statements of Austin Cowles and said he had never had any private conversation with Austin Cowles on these subjects, that he preached on this stand from the Bible, showing the order in ancient days having nothing to do with the present time. And so what he means by that is he was preaching that in the beginning, in Adam and Eve's day, man was married by God and by God's authority, and that was no longer on the earth. And that was something that would need to be restored. Not polygamy. Adam and Eve were not polygamous, but the ancient order of God's marriages. Hiram testified that the revelation had nothing to do with polygamy and that any man who claimed as much was lying. Joseph spoke again and testified that he had never preached the revelation in private as he had in public. He had not, now this is very important, he had not taught it to the anointed in the church in private, and many confirmed that. He further explained on inquiring of God regarding the passage in the Bible that in the resurrection they neither marry, etc. I received for an answer, men in this life must be married in view of eternity. And that was the full amount of the revelation. Otherwise, they must remain as angels in heaven. Joseph spoke to the city council at considerable length in explanation of these principles. So you might be wondering how, if Joseph never taught, practiced, or preached polygamy, then where did it come from? Because it is a known fact that there were several men and women in Nauvoo who were practicing polygamy, and those involved at the time called it spiritual wifery. As a side note, if Joseph was innocent and fighting to end the practice and eradicate it from the church, then where did it come from? So there are a few main known and provable characters. The first is John Bennett. He was a womanizer and philanderer who left his wife and children, came to Nauvoo, was baptized, and infiltrated every aspect of the church, from mayor of Nauvoo to general in the Nauvoo Legion to member of the first presidency. A letter from somebody who knew Bennett before arrived to Joseph exposing Bennett. Joseph confronted him, and Bennett claimed he was repentant and would stop, but he did not. In the spring of 1842, when he was exposed again, Hiram confronted him. He admitted his guilt and that he had lied about learning polygamy from Joseph. Bennett was excommunicated and left Nauvoo. He turned bitter and spent a lot of time and effort lying in order to smear Joseph's name. After Joseph and Hiram's deaths, Bennett joined with James Strang and tried to get polygamy going in that group. He was then kicked out. What's interesting about that is that Strang did end up embracing polygamy when he began having an affair with his young secretary. The lies Bennett spread about Joseph back in 1842 are used as a foundation for the LDS Church's history today regarding Joseph practicing polygamy in Nauvoo. The other known and provable characters are Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and other members of the 12 and their inner circle. So while Bennett was doing his sexually deviant behaviors in Nauvoo from about 1840 to 1842, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and other men were in England on missions. They were there from about 1839 to 1843-ish. Brigham and Heber came back in 1840, but some of the other men stayed longer. Brigham Young and Lorenzo Snow both claimed that they had had personal revelations regarding polygamy while they were in England. Brigham and Heber both believed that they were to be like Abraham, a father of many nations. These men had more zeal than knowledge and fell prey to wresting the scriptures unto their own destruction. Joseph Fielding was one of the missionaries in England. He wrote in his diary a few years later that there was much speculation on how one became a celestial being. He wrote that he knew how, but he waited until after Joseph and Hiram's deaths to begin teaching it to his wife. And his idea was, and Brigham's was the same, Brigham in the Nauvoo temple taught people in the celestial room that to be in the celestial kingdom, they needed to have more than one wife. Joseph Fielding married his first polygamous wife in the Nauvoo temple in January 1846. She was 7 months pregnant with his child at the time. After Joseph and Hiram's deaths, polygamy became much more rampant, with Brigham and Heber sealing men and women in polygamous marriages beginning in August of 1844, long before they set up an endowment and sealing room in the Nauvoo temple. That didn't begin until 1846. Brigham also ended the Relief Society in Nauvoo because the women were teaching each other what the Book of Mormon, particularly the Book of Jacob, said against polygamy and using their knowledge against their husbands. Joseph Fielding actually writes about that in his journal. Oh, excuse me. Joseph Fielding actually wrote about that in his journal and said that his wife kept telling him that the Book of Jacob is against polygamy. And he would say in his journal, he'd say, well, we men know more than our wives do. So why would Brigham place polygamy on Joseph's shoulders? So Brigham learned very quickly that the saints were hard to persuade if ideas and teachings did not come from Joseph. So using Joseph's name got Brigham and Heber the results they wanted. After Joseph's death, when Brigham was trying to get the United States government to allow him to practice polygamy, he had to claim that it was a foundational teaching from Joseph in order to practice polygamy under freedom of religion. I find that very interesting that Stephen tonight was telling us that in Utah, they allow them now to practice polygamy under freedom of religion. So it's too bad Brigham's not still alive, because now he could practice it without the government breathing down his neck. So the lies that Brigham started in order to convince people to do polygamy and to convince the US government to allow him to practice it are also used as the foundation of the LDS Church's history today. So here's an example of how Joseph, maybe you're not aware if you are, but after Joseph died, Brigham Young and other members of the 12 commenced correcting the history of the church. And that's actually quoted from their journals. They said today was spent in correcting the history. This continued for decades. Author Richard Van Wagoner stated that more than a dozen references to Brigham Young's involvement in transposing the written history may be found in the post-martyrdom record, first published in book form in 1902 as History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So one of the greatest gifts that I think we've been given in this modern age is the Joseph Smith Papers. That was funded by Larry H. Miller, who wanted the world to get to know Joseph. I do not agree with a lot of the footnotes, because the editors, when they actually published the papers into book form, they put in a lot of notes and commentary, and they still have the LDS mindset that Joseph did do polygamy, and so everything they write is tainted with that idea. But if you just go to the website and don't read their commentary, but just read Joseph's own words for himself, you can find those there. And so you can find the original historical documents as well as entries in Joseph's journal. So I wanted to just show you an example of Brigham Young's edits to show the new order of things. And so there were a lot of people back in the day that came to Utah and got to know Brigham Young. They investigated the church, investigated polygamy, and a lot of them came to the conclusion that it was Brigham's order of things and that it originated with Brigham Young and did not originate with Joseph Smith. And so they called it a new order of things. So the original entry in Joseph's October 5th, 1843 journal entry, and it's important to know this is 3 months after the LDS Church claims that he had received the polygamy revelation, what they call the polygamy revelation. This is what Joseph had recorded in his journal. Thursday, October 5th, 1843. Eve at home walked up and down street with scribe and gave instruction to try those who were teaching the doctrine of plurality of wives. On this law, Joseph forbids it and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. So that was edited. You can see actually on the Joseph Smith Papers website, you can find the first draft of the history of the church. And you can see the additions. They deleted 10 words and added 49 others, so that now it reads, Eve at home walked up and down street with scribe, gave instructions to try those persons who are preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives. For according to the law, I hold the keys of this power in the last days. For there is never but one on earth at a time whom the power and its keys are conferred. And I have constantly said, no man shall have but one wife at a time, unless the Lord directs otherwise. So the edits support Brigham Young's agenda of polygamy, but the original version proves that Joseph condemned plural marriage. So there's an image I took off today off of the Joseph Smith Papers website of the original. And here's one off of the edited and corrected for the first draft of History of the Church. So in April and May of 1844, Joseph, this to me is significant because this is the very end of his life. He gets up in conference and he says, it is our purpose to build up and establish the principles of righteousness, not to break and destroy. The great Jehovah has ever been with me. I feel in closer communion and better standing with God than ever I felt before in my life. April 7th, the next day, he told the saints, you never knew my heart. No man knows my history. I never did harm any man since I had been born in the world. My voice is always for peace. And when I am called to the trump and weighed in the balance, you will know me then. May 26th, he says, I had not been married scarcely 5 minutes and made one proclamation of the gospel before it was reported that I had 7 wives. I mean to live and proclaim the truth as long as I can. This new holy prophet, William Law, had gone to Carthage and swore that I had told him that I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifeism, why a man dares not speak or wink for fear of being accused of this. A man asked me whether the commandment was given that a man may have 7 wives, and now the new prophet has charged me with adultery. I have rattled chains before in a dungeon for the truth's sake. I am innocent of all these charges, and you can bear witness of my innocence, for you know me yourselves. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one. I am the same man and as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers. So just really quick, I know we're running out of time here. In that April conference, Joseph and Hiram had called all of the elders home from their missions, and they had a special meeting only for the elders. And at that meeting, Hiram called spiritual wifery the damned foolish doctrine of polygamy. Hiram declared to the men that God has never commanded any man to practice polygamy. He then stated that any man that he and Joseph taught preaching or practicing polygamy would be called home from their missions, their preaching license revoked, their name printed in the paper for all the world to see, and excommunicated from the church. 3 weeks before his death, Joseph asked William Marks to help him expose the men in Nauvoo who were practicing polygamy and to excommunicate them. Joseph planned to preach from the stand against it and to eradicate it from the church once and for all. Days before his death, Joseph found out that Brigham and Heber had been secretly practicing polygamy. He told Emma he would deal with them once he had dealt with the Laws and the Fosters, but he never got the chance as he was killed a short time later. So what did the Lord say about Joseph Smith? In March 1839, Joseph said, God said to Joseph, cursed are all those that shall lift up the heel against my anointed, says the Lord, and cry, they have sinned. when they have not sinned before me, says the Lord, but have done that which was meet in my eyes and which I commanded them. But those who cry transgression do it because they are the servants of sin and are the children of disobedience themselves. And those who swear false against my servants, that they might bring them into bondage and death, woe unto them, because they have offended my little ones. They shall be severed from the ordinances of my house. Their baskets shall not be full, their houses and their barns shall famish, and they themselves shall be despised by those that flattered them. They shall not have right to the priesthood, nor their posterity after them from generation to generation. It had been better for them that a millstone had been hanged about their necks and they drowned in the depths of the sea. 2 days later, the Lord told him again, the ends of the earth shall inquire after your name, and fools shall have you in derision, and hell shall rage against you, while the pure in heart and the wise and the noble and the virtuous shall seek counsel and authority and blessings constantly from under your hand. And your people shall never be turned against you by the testimony of traitors. And although their influence shall cast you into trouble and into bars and walls, you shall be had in honor. And but for a small moment, and your voice shall be more terrible in the midst of your enemies than the fierce lion because of your righteousness, and your God shall stand by you forever and ever. The truth will set you free. So why does it matter whether or not Joseph taught or practiced polygamy? There's a few like fundamentalist groups that practice polygamy today, but really the main branches that broke off from the early restoration do not practice polygamy for the living. So what does it matter? D&C 1, the Lord says, what I, the Lord, have spoken, I have spoken, and I excuse not myself. And though heaven and earth pass away, my word shall not pass away, but shall all be fulfilled, whether by my own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. Lectures on faith tell us that knowing the truth about polygamy, well, it doesn't say that, but knowing the truth about polygamy gives us a correct idea of God's character, perfections, and attributes. And that is from Lectures on Faith. This matters because if we want to be the wise and the noble and the virtuous, we want to seek counsel and authority and blessings constantly from under Joseph's hand. So those who refuse to believe the testimony of traitors will be numbered among Joseph's people. So it's important because people every day are leaving Joseph's teachings because they believe he was a polygamist and a hypocrite and a liar. This matters because what Joseph taught in his dispensation is still binding upon us today. Again, too many turn away from his teachings. Joseph taught that a man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge. More truth and knowledge allows us to repent and turn to more fully face the Savior. Knowing the truth about Joseph will give those who have cursed Joseph or claimed he has sinned when he has not the opportunity to repent. So my question is, what will you choose to believe and say the truth is about Joseph Smith? Will you choose to be one of the fools who holds Joseph in derision? Will you choose to be one of the people who lifts up their heel against him? Will you be one of the people who say he has sinned when he has not and swears false against him? Or will you choose to be numbered among the pure in heart and the wise and the noble and the virtuous who seeks counsel and authority and blessings constantly from under Joseph's hand? Will you choose to be numbered among Joseph's people by believing he was an honest man? And will you choose to reject the testimony of traitors? Do you know Joseph? I invite you to come to know the real Joseph Smith. What you learn may surprise you and may even give you a greater reason to believe in Christ. So that is it.
Thank you, Whitney. And we would then like to open to questions and give the gallery a chance, the participants a chance to lay their questions before you. And as host, I get the privilege of the first question. There's a remarkable book by Todd Compton which is what's the wives of Joseph Smith. He lists 30 of them.
Mhm.
And on page 557, he says that polygamy for women as for men was a road to status. I find that very interesting and want to give you a chance to comment, but if polygamy was simply a road to status for people that could therefore claim an association with Joseph Smith and use that to promote themselves to have higher prestige, then that would appear to support your case. However, interesting is to find that Compton puts that comment near the end of his 30 women who claim to be wives of Joseph Smith.
Yeah, I agree with that comment. Interestingly enough, Eliza R. Snow, who was one of the most well-known women in Pioneer, Utah, she became a polygamous wife to Brigham Young. She did not start using the name Eliza Smith until 1869, when Emma came out and basically said some things against Brigham, against their Section 132, calling it, basically a bag of worms, and saying that Joseph had never practiced polygamy. And so Eliza R. Snow kind of took up, she was a little bit angry at that and a little put out. And so she started after that, started calling herself Eliza Smith and signing her name Eliza Smith and claiming to be a wife of Joseph. So it definitely did. I mean, we tend to, and it's not necessarily a good thing that we do this, but we see this everywhere around us, social media, especially, we have, Instagram influencers, and you get so many, your video goes viral on YouTube, right? And so you become this like little overnight sensation, and we have movie stars and kings and queens that we bow to. And so we tend to like to promote people to celebrity status. And so, the early saints were just like we are today. I mean, if you could claim an association with somebody who actually was important in God's kingdom, then by association, you got a little bit of street credit. So, yeah, I would agree with that assessment of Compton's.
This is Nancy Sherman, and I wondered, have you ever seen or read the book, The Exoneration of Emma, Joseph, and Hiram by Ronald Karen?
Yes.
I thought that was fascinating because that's the first time I had seen where they had changed the wording on so many things.
Yes. Yeah, that is, he does a pretty good job. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but I think overall, I think anytime we can start getting this stuff out there so that people can make a choice for themselves and see both sides of things, it's good.
I agree.
Ron Smith has his, sorry, Tex, you got something?
Yeah, I'm greatly appreciative of your research and what you brought to us tonight. That's what I want to hear.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tex. Ron Smith?
Yeah, I appreciate also what you had to say. Almost everything was great RLDS conservative point of view that I've heard all my life. But I was just a small thing. I know you had to pick and choose what you some of the things that you used. One of the things that I didn't see was the I think it was February 1844, if I'm correct, that Hiram Brown was kicked out of the church for teaching polygamy and other false and corrupt doctrines. That just was back in there. It came out in the Times and Seasons. And so I know that there are a number of people on both sides of the of the great divide between the RLDS and LDS that have concluded that he did have something to do with polygamy. But I'm on the side. I've always been on the side that said Joseph always, every time he said anything, was against polygamy in anything that's been recorded. And I think that's pretty significant. And so I appreciated your saying that.
Thank you. And so I do, in the book, I do include that about Hiram Brown, as well
Sure.
as Hiram Smith's letter to the men on China Creek,
Mm-hmm.
where they, wrote and said, well, a guy came in and asked him, is this really being taught here? Is this being done here? And so he writes the brethren of China Creek a letter saying, no higher priesthood gets any man more wives, kind of a thing. What's interesting is the man who instigated that letter after Joseph and Hiram's death, he actually wrote James Strain and said, I want to know what you believe, what your teachings are. And I specifically want to know what you believe about polygamy, because I personally have Hiram's letter that he and Joseph never believed in it, never taught it, never did it. And so I thought that was interesting. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
John Mueller.
Many years ago, I ran into the work of Flanders, Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi. I presume you've probably run into it somewhere along the line, Whitney. I don't remember what he had to say about, from his research about polygamy in that period of time. Does anybody have information on that?
I do not. Does anybody else? I actually am not familiar with that work.
I've got a copy of his book. It's been so long. It's probably been 50 years ago since I've cracked it. But I got it when I was shortly after I was at Graceland College. And I don't remember him talking about Joseph dealing with polygamy, but I do remember that he was very liberal in his teachings in that book. It was one of the required books for one of the classes that I took up there. Looks like Paul's got the book right there. There you go.
Yeah, the book does make reference to polygamy, but it almost exclusively puts it in the context of celestial marriage. He does. One of the remarkable things here is that he takes the note. I think it was William Clayton. I'm not real sure who the scribe was. Clayton was a miscreant in so many cases that I think he
was, yes.
I think he takes the note of the event in, I believe it was in the fall of 1843 in the southwest bedroom of the mansion house, where Joseph was ordained to be the king. That special session then is what becomes the title of his book, and then becomes a major factor in the revising of history from the vantage point of RLDS. And so, yeah, he does make mention to it, but he doesn't delve into Joseph Smith as a polygamist so much as he does highlights the celestial marriage idea.
Oh, gotcha.
Frank, go ahead. Did you have a question?
I just wanted to thank Whitney for her class and her book. I've got your book and haven't finished reading it yet. I've got a lot of other things I'm dealing with, but I'm a fifth generation in one line and the sixth generation in another line of my family. And our family refused to follow Brigham out of Nauvoo. Part of our family lived on the west side of the Mississippi River. And all of our family wound up in western Iowa, after the Exodus, and none of them would follow Brigham. One of our family did go from England. Parley Pratt had a child that died on the boat coming across, and one of my ancestors made a promise to take the body of the baby west to Utah, and they packed it in a box of salt, and he carried that because Parley wasn't going directly there. So he carried it out to Utah, and it took him 10 years to escape from there. They were trying to force him to marry more than one wife, and they finally got away one night when they left the light on in the cabin and snuck away and made the very dangerous trip back across the plains alone. Then when they came in a big wagon train, and there was a lot of safety in that. But when anybody tried to leave by themselves, it was a very dangerous trip. And they wound up living the rest of their lives in Omaha, Nebraska. But I have always believed, like Ron Smith points out, that Joseph was innocent of polygamy and of its teachings. I don't think he had anything to do with it. That's what our family has concluded too.
Nice. Don't you just love our history? Just our family histories even. I have
Yes.
One of my lines was converted in Ireland in the late 1800s, and he was a shipbuilder. And when he joined the LDS Church, he was fired from his job because he was in the very Catholic heavy area, and and he gave it all up, and his wife and children, to come to Utah and to accept Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. I mean, that's not something any of us should take lightly. If we have that family heritage that passed on, it's just a beautiful thing. I'm very grateful for my ancestors and their sacrifices.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Jerry Grover.
Yeah, I joined a little late, so maybe you answered this. Does your book try to address some of the items in the Brian Hales books? Like, does it go through that at all? Or, because he has like each supposed wife and their.
Right. So what I chose to do, so one of the things that the big moments for me in writing this book, I didn't start off with the idea that I would write a book. I just wanted to know the truth for myself. I actually had kind of come to a conclusion. My husband, like I said, was a bishop of an LDS ward, and I was in the Relief Society presidency at the time. And I was researching a lot of the history to try and help my children and my children's friends who were leaving over polygamy, about Joseph being a polygamist. And the more and more I read, the more bothered I became that he preached so staunchly against it, because I had been taught that he was lying for the Lord. And I finally came to the conclusion that he was a fallen prophet, because I just don't to me, like I said, polygamy matters because we need to understand the correct characteristics and attributes and perfections of God. And God tells us he cannot lie, he'd cease to be God. He also tells us he's no respecter of persons. I do not understand how any marriage that involves more than two, whether that's more than one husband or more than one wife, can be a marriage based on equals, how it can be a union that is one. And especially being an LDS, I've grown up not understanding how I was equal to men when everything about polygamy screamed to me that God thought less of his daughters. And so I decided that God is not involved with polygamy at all. I did a lot of research into Abraham in the Bible and into Jacob. And so I decided that Joseph was a fallen prophet. So I started researching for this book, for that reason. And one day, and I remember exactly where I was when it happened and what I was cleaning in the house as a stay-at-home mom at the time. And what the thought that came to me was, can you believe Joseph meant what he said? Can you give him that courtesy to believe he meant what he said? And that was the first time that I considered that Joseph had not lied for the Lord, because he hadn't lied at all. He had been honest, truthful in everything he said and everything he did. And so actually the very first book I read was Richard and Pamela Price's series on Joseph fought polygamy. And that was like the first time in my life that I considered that Joseph was actually innocent. And so that was really pivotal for me. And then just the more and more I studied, the more I found as I wrote this. Just to me, the evidence is compelling. And so I stuck with, because I wanted to believe what Joseph meant what he said, I stuck with things Joseph said at the time period he said it. So it was true and honest and recorded at the time. And so I didn't go into really much at all about all of the wives that Brian Hales assigns to him, because those affidavits came, 1869. And if you read those affidavits, like some of them that I found, the witnesses were little tiny children at the time it supposedly happened, when those people had older siblings that could have witnessed. And so, but those older siblings are still alive when the affidavits brought out. So just some fishy stuff like that. But also the affidavits, they're very cleverly written, because they say married or sealed. So if Joseph was sealing people to him, they were being sealed as children, because he and Emma were an exalted couple. I mean, Emma is called an elect lady in the Doctrine and Covenants. They were an exalted elect couple. So it is possible, and I've not yet been able to find definitive proof from the time period that Joseph was alive to prove that he actually was doing any sealings at all. Any information on sealings comes well after his death. But if he was, they would have only been his children. And therefore, Emma was telling the truth when she said he never had any other women sealed to him as wives. And those women in Utah in 1869 technically could have been telling the truth, because they were sealed, because the wording was married or sealed. And so they could maybe rationalize in their minds that they weren't lying, because they were sealed as children if they were. But all of those women were resealed in the Nauvoo Temple by Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball in 1846. There's a book called Nauvoo Proxy Sealings and Marriages, and they resealed, sorry about that, they resealed, that's what they claim. I believe it was a first time sealing, that they sealed those women to Joseph and Hiram. And then interestingly enough, told the women they could only be sealed to a deceased man if they were sealed to them as a living spouse. So there you get Hiram Smith's second wife, Mary, who becomes a polygamous wife to Heber C. Kimball. It's based on that same idea that she had chosen not to be sealed to Hiram when he was living. He talks about that in his April 8th conference talk, that he went home and told Mary, hey, Joseph got this revelation. He's teaching me this principle of man needing to be sealed. I had a wife, Jerusha, she died before we knew this. But now I've got you as a wife, so what do you want to do? And he says Mary actually chose to let him be sealed to Jerusha, and she stood as proxy. And so then after he dies, the family story is, and even in records, that Heber C. Kimball said, well, I can seal you to Hiram, but you have to be sealed to me as a wife, as a living husband. And so that's where she never even lived with Hiram or Heber as a polygamous wife. Like Mary got to Utah and went off and lived by herself and raised the kids on her own without him. So, and she actually dies just 2 weeks before Brigham announces polygamy publicly in 1852 in conference. So I do not think that's a coincidence. I think once she died, they felt that the last person that could stand up against them had passed away. And so then they announced it publicly. So I do go a little bit into my book, a little bit about what the women did and what their motivation was. Phoebe Woodruff, she states that her motive for claiming and claiming polygamy is from God was that Wilford actually threatened to kick her out and abandon her if she did not publicly agree and promote polygamy. So I go into some of those women and some of their stories, and all of them are heartbreaking. There's not one good one.
Just
It was-
one little follow-up. This is not to be critical. It's just I have a kind of a interest in this because my great-great-grandfather was on the High Council that excommunicated Oliver Cowdery. Do you talk a little bit about the Fanny Alger, Oliver Jew, and then the family?
Yes, yeah. And if I were to write it today, because I've been doing more research, because I'm working on a second book about something else right now. I've been doing more research into it. I'm not so sure today that Joseph did any kind of a sealing with Fanny Alger. If he did, it was as a child to he and Emma. But the witnesses or the people who claim are like Oliver Cowdery. He's just heard it secondhand, so he starts spreading a rumor that it was adultery, right? And then you've got I think it's, I can't remember, Levi Hancock, I think, or Levi Savage, I can't remember the name right now. But his son in the 1890s writes a biography of his dad, calls it a biography, so tries to claim that his dad wrote it himself, but it's actually the son. And the son says, my dad performed the sealing of Fanny to Joseph. But it's like 1890s and he's a polygamist. So you always have to ask yourself, if they're practicing polygamy, they have a vested interest in making sure we all think Joseph did it, right? But Fanny Alger, there's actually a source out there that says that Fanny Alger, the incident or the affair was that back then the word affair meant anything from getting in trouble by your employer because you were doing a bad job, from stealing something, like she could have stolen something from the house and they would have called it a dirty, nasty affair because it got ugly. Like she leaves town pretty much right away. Her parents leave and take her right away. She tells her brother later, years and years later, he says, what happened between you and Joseph? And she says, that is all, that's just for me and Joseph to know. So there are some stories out there that what happened was that Fanny, she's like 15, Joseph's like 30, she like hit on him and he and Emma fired her.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's even a fair, because I think Bradley's done some research on that. It was like overwritten. It was scrape was the underlying word or something in the, but anyway, one reason I just wondered is because my great-great-grandfather, him and Brigham Young were loggerheads all the time. So I would have thought he probably would have just stayed. If he did.
Who is your great-great-grandfather? What was his name?
Thomas Grover. So,
okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was on the first party to cross and he ran the ferry at the Platte after he had a big argument with Brigham Young, and Brigham designed a raft and it sunk, and then so I don't know. It's just kind of, I'm just trying to kind of make sense of my own history a little bit.
Sure. Sure. History is always told about the victor, right? So it's whoever writes it kind of puts their spin on it. And that's, for me too, I don't claim to be a professional historian. And that's why I titled it A Faithful Telling, because it's just from my research, the conclusions I came to, put it out there in the world. You can read it and say, she's up in the night and she doesn't know what she's talking about. or you can read it and go, oh, this is interesting, or you can read it and go, yep, I've always thought that. I mean, you know, that's the beautiful thing, right? Is that we have all these histories to choose from and all these stories, and we can choose for ourselves.
Is that on Amazon then? Are you selling it on
It
Amazon?
is, yes. And all the, my husband likes me to say this because I don't know why, but he likes me to let everybody know that any proceeds are all donated to charity, because he likes to make sure people know I did not write this to make money. I just wanted to, I mostly wrote this for my daughters and my granddaughters. And then other people have been reading it. So that's been nice.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Okay, we've got quite a few folks in the queue. We've got about 5 people right now. So
Okay.
Paul DeGarth, you guys are next.
All right, thank you. In 1843 in May, the 4 missionaries left Nauvoo to go to Polynesia. The gospel message that they shared in Polynesia at that time was the gospel of monogamy. My wife is the 5th generation of since then of people that were converted by those missionaries and who taught that the nature of that gospel. And it was only later, after the Mormon missionaries approached Polynesia, that the polygamy issue was brought in. So at least as late as May of 1843, the message, the official church message, was exclusive of polygamy.
Yes.
That is the message that Benjamin Gerard and Knowlton Hanks and Noel Rogers and
Mhm.
one more took, and it just, to me, that's a fascinating support for what you're saying, because here's a culture that maintained the teachings for 20 years afterwards before the reorganization reconnected with them, and so they're still teaching monogamy in that branch.
That is wonderful. That's such a wonderful heritage. That's neat.
Let Rena speak to it.
I wanted to add though, my ancestors were pagan, and their idea of becoming gods is very prevalent. That's what they believed. So if the Mormons came at that time, they would have been just welcome. Polygamy will be welcome as well. And that's what they, I mean, it would have been very
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So if they would have come teaching polygamy, it would have been well accepted and received.
Right.
And so that is a testament that they were teaching monogamy, because that wasn't what your people would have been ready for.
That's correct. And
Yeah, that's neat.
yeah,
Thank
also
you for sharing that.
monotheism. The Mormon proclivity that men may become gods was a later addition, not something that was
right.
coming out of Nauvoo in
Exactly.
1843. So
Interesting.
monotheism and monogamy were tied together.
And then you change. People change.
Oh, were you done?
No, but go ahead. I'll come back.
Okay, Rick, you're next.
All right, thanks Whitney for your, let's see, am I muted? No,
No,
okay,
we can hear
I'm
you.
okay. I just didn't move and my hand was still there, so thanks Whitney for your research. I'm surprised from coming from an LDS person that you attached the lie to Brigham, and I wonder if you've been ostracized, shunned, or whatever for pinning it on him. Has anything happened to you?
Well, not really with this book, but when at the same, so kind of concurrent at the same time as me writing it, my husband and I were falsely accused of, well, we were accused, not rightfully so, we were rightfully accused of putting too much weight on Joseph Smith and not on the current brethren. And so we were getting in trouble with our bishop for we were reading the Joseph Smith papers. We were trying to, like, we felt like we didn't really know Joseph and the religion that he had restored. And so we were getting, we were kind of getting at odds with our bishop over that. But, and then we had a man in our ward who was believing in some other things that we were acquaintances with. And so our bishop took an opportunity to silence us by lumping us in with this other man. So we basically, just before I started writing this book, we were basically told, we will not excommunicate you if you stop coming to church. And so we've not been to church for several years. We just do home church at home. We've tried some other religions out, and we've tried going to some other things, but we just love the Book of Mormon so much. So we just study the Book of Mormon every Sunday at home with our children. And so I have not had any interaction with any church leadership about this book, but I would sure hope that, well, I'm pretty nice in my book about Brigham. I try to, because I do think that he did claim he received a revelation, and I do think that he was acting on a revelation he received, not understanding that it was from a false spirit. So I'm very kind in this book, but I have since then uncovered more information that will be coming out in my next book. And so it will be interesting to see if I am still left alone or if I do get more heat from the next one.
Okay.
There will be more evidence coming out that definitely shows a little bit more of who was doing what to pin it on Joseph.
Okay, well, way to go. Thanks for your bravery. There was a question in the chat about the numbering of the Doctrine and Covenants that you used, whether it was LDS numbering or some other.
Oh, yeah, you probably didn't see, I put a little footnote. So when I used the Bible, I used the Holy Inspired, but then when I did Doctrine and Covenants and Book of Mormon, I used the LDS. Just because that's what I'm pretty easily familiar with.
Okay. Well, hopefully they're listening and they got the answer to the question. Are you familiar with, just another thing to add with your list of wonderful Book of Mormon passages about not supporting polygamy? I too have been kind of looking through the Book of Mormon as I read it, and there were several times when there was a lot of women left over after the wars and the men were killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Mosiah 9, which is, I use the RLDS, but it's LDS 2117. It says, now there was a great number of women more than there was of men. Therefore, King Limhi commanded that every man should impart to the support of the widows and their children, that they might not perish with hunger. And this they did because of the greatness of their number that had been slain. So here's a perfect time when if polygamy would have been okay to raise up seed back in Jacob, that they could have instituted that right there, but they didn't.
Absolutely. That was one of the things too. Thank you for bringing that up, because that was one of my other aha moments. Before I tried to figure out about Joseph, I was trying to figure out about God and if God really ever commanded polygamy. And
yeah,
the LDS Church doesn't outright teach that God's a polygamist, but they do subtly teach it, that there's lots of wives in heaven for him, right?
Yeah.
And so I was trying to figure that out, and I had the thought one day, I'm like, if the whole raise up seed, I'll command him to raise up seed. Like, wouldn't a perfect time have been with Adam and Eve? Like, we're starting a whole world. Like, wouldn't that have been the time God should have given Adam a whole bunch of wives?
Yeah, be fruitful and multiply.
Right. And then when Lehi's coming to America again, Lehi's comes with just his family. Wouldn't that have been a great time for him to say, Lehi, take a bunch of women as wives so you can have lots of babies and populate this place?
Right.
So
how many ribs did Eve have?
This is a good one. So for me, that just answered the question for me, that God,
Yep.
and in the image of God, male and female, it's one,
Mhm.
you know, so.
So when I read Jacob, that part of Jacob
Oh, come on.
2, verse 30, it says that he is going to raise up seed, and it occurred to me that there's a levirate marriage listed in Deuteronomy 25:5.
Mhm.
I'm familiar with that.
Yes, so that's actually one of the justifications Brigham and Heber used after Joseph and Hiram's death, is they were going to women whose husbands had died and telling them, you need to marry us under the law of levirate marriage so that we can give you your first husband, we can give him children.
If they didn't already have children.
Well, so the levirate marriage is if you don't have a son.
Right.
You're gonna have a lot
Right.
of girls, but if you didn't have
Right.
a son, it was to give you a son, because then sons were to
Yes.
take care of their mother in her old age.
Yeah, but that passage in the new, there's 3 different gospels that mention that trap that they were trying to catch Jesus in,
Yeah.
about whose wife will she be in heaven. They were
Mhm.
referring to that levirate marriage.
Yes.
And he says that there's no marriage in heaven. They're like the angels in heaven.
Yeah.
And the passage in Jacob 2 says raise up seed, and raise up offspring is in those same 3 gospels. Raise up offspring to the
Yeah,
son.
it's a corruption of what God really meant. It's a corruption from Adam. You know, we all know that the Deuteronomists messed up the Bible quite a bit, and they did change things to support and justify David and Solomon's polygamy.
Right. But in Genesis 38:8, Judah is supposed to provide one of his sons to raise up seed to one of his daughters-in-law. And the couple of sons try, or they don't even try. They say no, and God kills 2 of the sons. And so then the youngest son is too young to help the situation out. So he tells her to go home and wait. Well, Judah lies, and he ends up having sex with her as she's dressed as a prostitute to fulfill that levirate marriage. So yeah, it's kind of sordid, isn't it?
Yeah.
So when I read the Jacob 2 part about raising up seed, I think of the levirate marriage, but maybe that's incorrect.
So
Okay.
it goes back, you got to go to the paragraph before when he says, I brought you out of Jerusalem to raise up a righteous branch.
Righteous branch, right.
It's to raise people up to become disciples and righteous men and women, to become people that he will qualify themselves for him to say, I will count you as my son or my daughter, because you have raised up out of the natural man and out of the world. And so I command my people, meaning I will give you commandments, because if he wants just heathen natural man people, he's not going to give them any commandments. But when he wants people to raise up and raise their sights higher than the drudge of this world, he gives them commandments to help them overcome the natural man and overcome the ways of this world. So you gotta, and to be honest, I mean, I'm assuming you all know, because you're all like these amazing Book of Mormon scholars, that it wasn't punctuated by Joseph. It was not punctuated by Oliver. It was punctuated by John Gilbert, who is a 21-year-old who knew the Bible. And so you could actually even repunctuate that and say, if I want to raise up seed, period, and then I will command my people otherwise, and then keep going, which then reiterates, do not have more than one wife. So that's kind of a tricky thing with the Book of Mormon, is that it was punctuated by a guy who doesn't know the gospel. So, I mean, he tried his best, but yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give other people a chance. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we still have 5 people in the queue. Wanda, did you still have your question? And then Monty. Wanda?
There you
I
go.
wanted to just mention that Ina DeBarth, Paul's and David's mother, and had written her master's degree thesis on the subject of who wrote the so-called revelation on polygamy. And she did it by comparing the writings of about 5 or 6 different men. I'm not sure about the number, but Paul should know more about it than I do. But anyway, she concluded, because of the nature of the wordings and their figures of speech, that Brigham Young wrote it. That
Yes,
Joseph-
I read her whole thesis. I found it online. Somebody put it online and I read it and I quoted in my book. Yeah, and what just absolutely amazes me about her work is she did it in like 1969, right, Paul?
Yes.
Before computers. She did that all because she by hand. Brilliant woman. Brilliant.
I know.
It just amazes me. But
Yeah.
yeah, I read her whole thesis. It's amazing. It's really well done.
You don't know me, but I'm her sister-in-law.
Oh, well, so then you do know how brilliant she was. You have firsthand.
So we had copies of it here.
Yeah, I'm very
Her
grateful.
youngest brother was 20 years younger than she was, or yeah, 20 years. So I'm married to him.
Oh, okay. All right.
And we're both in our 90s now.
Well, you would know it. You don't look that old at all. You look
I'm 91, he's 90. So
you're Paul's aunt.
yes.
Okay. Okay.
And David's.
Oh, okay. Yep, I see him on there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, she did. That's worth, anybody who hasn't read that, it is worth
I
your
wondered
time
if
to
you
read
had
it.
come across it
Yeah.
anywhere.
Yeah, some kind and generous soul digitized it and put it online, so I was able to read it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Wanda. Whitney, we do have a request that you put your email in the chat, if you could.
Okay.
And then we have Monty and then Marlene. We've still got 4 people in the queue.
Whitney, I'm not going to try to keep you long. I just wanted to thank you for the research you've done. Years ago, when I joined the church I'm in, Community of Christ, I joined because I was able to accept the Book of Mormon as scripture. And it wasn't so much a belief in Joseph Smith as it was in the Book of Mormon itself. And I've never expected him to be anything more than a human being. I mean, so anything anybody says to me about it, I just kind of take it with a grain of salt and go on from there. But I accept the Book of Mormon and our Doctrine and Covenants was enough to convince me that I wanted to become a member of the church. And that's what's kept me these years. As for the polygamy issue, I've been trying to learn how to be a loving, supportive, affirming husband. And I'm still working on it after 49 years. So I can't even conceive of trying to do this with more than one woman.
I know. I used to tell my husband, I'd say, you can hardly even handle me. How could you handle more than one? Because I'm kind of a handful. So
Thank you very much. I'll
Thank
let somebody
you.
else talk.
Thank you.
Okay, Marlene, it's your turn. Thank you for your patience.
I just wanted to take a moment and tell Whitney how much I have appreciated this tonight. I thank you so much for the time and effort you put in all the research and how it just really reaffirmed. I'm an old staunch RLDSer, and that just really brought it all home to me all over again. And I thank you so much. I'm really sorry that the LDS Church has treated you as they have. And I'm sure that any RLDS Church, Community of Christ churches in the area would be more than happy to have you to be a part of their congregation if you so choose to do. But thank you again so very, very much. And I just pray that God will continue to bless you as you serve him. Thank you again.
you. Here's a fun little story. When our youngest son is 21, he's at West Point in New York in the military. He's a cadet back there. But when he was about 7, we stopped and toured the Community of Christ Temple. I went into their little bookstore and he found an 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and he asked if we would buy it for him. And from the age of 7, he was like, this is the one I want to read, because it was published when Joseph was alive. So he would take that to church with them, little teeny one. It was cute. So yeah, and we were very welcome there. We were able to join a service there, and it was a nice experience. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marlene. David DeBarth, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. That's wonderful. I am confident that Mother Enid would want to accept you as a spiritual daughter, because you've done the kind of thing that she advocated all her life, that you had to look for the truth, regardless of what it might cost. You had to go find it. And I really, really appreciate your courage and what you've done. I wanted to add from my own testimony, been a number of years ago, but I read a couple times, I read the autobiography of Joseph III. And Joseph III, of course, is very adamant about his father never being part of that terrible polygamy kind of thing. But the argument has been that Joseph III was just a boy. He was only about 12 when his father was killed, so he couldn't know what's going on. I personally, as the oldest son, and by the age of 8, I was a full-time farmhand, working side by side with my dad, and a full-time also with my mother. My brother Jerry was 17 months younger, and he joined us very quickly. And so by the time we were 12, we were part of family council, and we knew what was going on in the family. And I would suggest that in the close-knit families, that's the way it was, that those older children especially were deeply involved in what their parents were involved in. And so I will not buy in any sense that Joseph III didn't know what was going on with his father. And in one final note, I've always been intrigued on how Joseph's personal journals ended up in Salt Lake City instead of belonging to his family.
I was actually just talking to my husband about that last night. I think it's because the scribes kept them and they brought them with them. So like Willard Richards, you know, he was Brigham's cousin. So I think that's how. And I actually was asking my husband last night, I'm like, how do you think Emma felt about that? You know, her husband's been killed and then she doesn't get to have his journals, you know. Yeah. So I don't know, I'm sure that if you've read Joseph III's biography, then you are familiar with the vision he had of his mom and dad. So his mom had passed away just a few years earlier, and he had a vision. He had been just finished up with his evening scripture study. And he said he was suddenly in his mother's kitchen. And he said in the vision, she appeared to be in her mid-30s and she was doing the dishes. And she came over and sat down in a chair next to Joseph, saying, now, Joseph, your father is here and you can ask him the questions that you've been asking me to see whether I've been telling you the truth or not. As soon as Emma spoke to his father, Joseph III turned and saw him sitting on a settee. Joseph presented an appearance more matured than when his son had last seen him, such as he might have had he lived to be in his early 40s. Joseph III turned to his father and asked, Father, do you know what Mother and I have been talking about? Joseph replied, yes, my son, I do. Are you prepared to answer the question whether she has told me the truth or not? I am. What is your answer? You may depend upon it that your mother has told you nothing but the truth. I think that's just beautiful. So of course he's referring to polygamy. You know, he'd been asking his mom if his dad had other wives, and Emma always adamantly denied that Joseph had any other wives but her. So I think that's just a beautiful, what a beautiful mercy, for their son to have that experience. It just put it to rest once and for all for him.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron Edwards and then Paul DeBarth.
Whitney, do you know what Bennett's position was in the church when it was first being put together out there in Utah?
Well, Bennett did not come to Utah. John Bennett, he did not come to Utah. He stayed back in the Midwest, and he joined up with James String. And James String was the group up in Michigan. And so Bennett went and joined up with String and started doing his same shenanigans, got kicked out, but then James String actually ended up getting involved in polygamy. He had a 19-year-old secretary and started having an affair with her. And so then he magically received a revelation to do polygamy and took her as his first polygamous wife. I think he ended up with 5, before, and James String ended up being killed.
Okay, so, well, then I've got him mixed up with somebody else, because this person became worked right under Brigham Young. He was kind of the second man, I don't know, in charge, or I don't know what his title was, but he was in the upper echelons, and if my memory serves me right, he was the second person, under Brigham.
So are you thinking of Heber C. Kimball?
Kimball.
Heber C. Kimball and Brigham had been best friends. They'd grown up together, and they both joined the church together, and they did everything together and served missions together, got into polygamy together, came to Utah together. So it could have been Kimball, maybe.
Was he in Nauvoo when Joseph was killed?
Yes. Well, Kimball wasn't. So he lived in Nauvoo, but Kimball and Brigham were part of the group that had gone back east to campaign for Joseph's presidency. So they were in the Boston and New England area when Joseph was killed. But there was Willard Richards, that's Brigham's cousin, and he was pretty high up. He was in Carthage with Joseph, and so is John Taylor.
Well.
Does William Clayton make any?
William Clayton was in Nauvoo, and he came out with Brigham and them.
Well, I don't know if how much exploration into this topic has been done, but and this goes back to a Sunday school class in our congregation that was on the Book of Mormon, and the person that was teaching it, I would put him in the detective scientific scientist category. And one of the classes, every so often he would go off on a tangent, and this was on his research on how Joseph was killed. And he at least to my way of thinking, he pretty well proved that the bullet did not come from the ground. It came from up in that same room where Joseph was. And the short story was that it was the guy that became second in command of the Mormon Utah church. He was the one that shot Joseph.
So the only two that were in the room with them were Willard Richards, who became church historian, and John Taylor, who did become a president of the church, the Utah church.
The second president.
Second president. So that I really got his name mixed up then.
Well, they're both Johns.
That goes back 10, maybe that's it. I don't know, but it goes back 10 or 15 years. But
yeah, there's a lot of people right now. That's kind of one of the things right now that's getting investigated more into is the murder. I don't know, if they could ever prove. I'm not a forensic or a detective of that kind. So, you know, I don't know, but for sure, we all know we're all from different branches, right? We know that there was quite a schism and quite a vying for succession, you know, afterwards. And really, I mean, when Joseph and Hiram died, I mean, there goes your patriarch, your prophet, co-presidents, co-prophets. They both were prophets. And then you're just left kind of with a power vacuum. You know, Joseph III was just young, right? And so, you know, you've got Sidney Rigdon, who's claiming he had a vision that he's supposed to be a caretaker until Joseph III's old enough. You've got Brigham Young, who's saying, you know, Brigham Young's platform was, when Jesus died, who carried the church forward was the 12. So the 12 here need to carry it forward. You know, I know the LDS Church today says that Brigham Young was conferred all the keys upon him. Well, keys just mean the ability to ask heaven a question and get an answer. That's what Joseph taught. But it was actually, I think it was Orson Hyde, that when Brigham and Heber get back in town in August, the Orson Hyde says to them, hey, I overheard Joseph say, on the 12 rests the kingdom. So there's no evidence of him actually conferring any authority of any kind on them other than their authority to go preach the gospel. So that's a whole, I mean, there's so many different avenues, but you know, the people made choices. All my family chose to follow Brigham. My husband's split, half stayed, half came. You know, I mean, it was a pretty difficult time, I think, for the saints. It split families apart. I think it was really difficult. And I'm just very grateful to all of those people from any of the branches, because they kept alive the history of Joseph and they kept the Book of Mormon in print. You know, so I'm just so grateful for my heritage, and I'm grateful that God's willing to keep working with me and teach me more.
Have you do you have the book, or have you read part of the book written by two ladies on Emma Smith? I believe it's called the Enigma of Emma.
Yeah, Emma Smith, Mormon Enigma.
Yeah.
I haven't read every page. I've kind of skimmed through it.
That's what I've done.
Yeah, I just really struggle because so many books written by members of the LDS Church, it's just so difficult to open the mind to a concept that Joseph never practiced it. And so everything's written with the lens that the LDS Church's history is 100% foolproof true. And I just get a little bit nauseated when they assign emotions to Emma that I don't believe she ever even had to deal with because her husband was faithful to her. So I struggle a little bit.
One of the things that you kind of brought to my mind tonight, in that book, Emma is recorded as saying that when Joseph was headed out, I'm thinking one night, doesn't make any difference about that part, but he was headed to a meeting, and he let Emma know. He said, well, if something happens to me, it's because I'm opposed to polygamy. And something did happen to him.
Yeah.
So that kind of all ties together with the second.
Yeah, that is definitely something I'm curious what really caused his death, because there's also I don't know if there were apostles of the RLDS Church, but I think Blair is the name that interviewed Emma towards the end of her life, and in that interview she said that he was killed for political reasons. I mean, like, a lot of people don't know his stance on slavery. Like, it was brilliant. If the government would have done his idea, we would have such a different America. I mean, his idea was to buy the slaves their freedom. So the government was to reimburse. So none of the plantation owners would be harmed financially.
Mhm.
And then he was like, and then we need to build schools and educate them so they can be contributing members of society.
Mhm.
I mean, it would have been a completely peaceful resolution, right? But it was a really hot topic. So politics definitely could have been what killed him. Polygamy,
Mhm.
I mean, he was getting ready to really eradicate it from the LDS church or the Restoration Church, whatever you want to call his latter hyphen little d or big D day. His was latter no hyphen big D. And then Brigham changed it to latter hyphen little d. So Joseph, was getting ready to, he said it would be the downfall of the Restoration if it continued. So there's that going on. He and Hiram are going guns a-blazing, trying to root it out. That's it. That definitely got people on their bad side. You got the laws, printing their novel expositor, riling up people. I mean, it just became, I think, this perfect storm. And the powers of hell combined against them and took them out. So
Yeah. Well, that's all that I saved my question to the last because I don't figure it's all that important for one thing. But I never heard. I've never known about your book. I didn't know who you were. So I have to thank Paul for that. It's amazing what he does. And you've just done an amazing job of setting the world straight on this topic that comes up frequently, unfortunately. And so big thanks for what you've done. That is for sure.
thank you. Appreciate your words.
So
Okay.
that's it.
Thanks, Ron. Paul DeBarth, you're next, and then Frank Fry. Unmute, Paul.
Yes, and thank you, Whitney. You gave me an insight tonight that I've been needing because for Hiram Smith's family to go west and support polygamy has, well, it's harkened back to their claim on the history that Hiram took a second wife in 1843, which would have been under Joseph Smith's direction.
Right.
But when you look at and see that wife then became the wife of Hebrew Kimball afterwards, that begins to answer the question for me. And for her to die just 2 weeks before, as you indicated, before the change of policy after the last witness was gone, well, that one really strikes me as being a good answer. So especially I want to thank you for that point.
Thank you.
I've been excavating on the Hiram Smith office and store site, and I'm fascinated because there's so many descendants of Hiram Smith, and many of them anxious to come dig there. And it's fascinating because they get to find these artifacts that may very well date back to when Hiram and his family were there. And it's, well, the fact is we didn't mean to open that site because we were working on the Samuel Smith site, but there were so many people wanting to dig on the site of their ancestor on the Hiram Smith site that we ended up opening that site just to accommodate.
Well, that's wonderful.
The fact is we've not been able to dig for the last 2 seasons, but we do hope to be open again May and June of this next year for a resumption of those 2 sites. I have had the privilege of spending periodically, well, over 20 years since 1971, digging on the Joseph Smith historic sites, and so I've gotten reasonably well acquainted with him. And I have sent to the editor the story of the Mansion House, where we conducted a significant, extensive archaeological investigation. And there's clearly a lot of the stories, mythologies, personal histories that trace back to the mansion, many of them with the women who claim to have been his wives, one who claimed to have spent the night there. However, the irony there is that she claims to have spent the night there before the church recognizes that the mansion was even occupied.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
therefore, she would have been spending the night with him in the upper bedroom, which would have been the homestead, which doesn't make any sense because that's where Emma would have been. And so, you get these fascinating conflicts. And so I'm trying to incorporate as many of those accounts into the book as I can. And clearly the fact that it was the campaign center for the presidential campaign of a presidential candidate who was assassinated. That to me is a highly significant point of American history. So anyway,
Yeah, but that history is not shared enough. That's very, I think that's very important that people need to know.
given the modern politic, I think for us to appreciate that
Mhm.
when politics gets to that violent extreme, there is a very serious consequence to pay.
Well, and you didn't just have Joseph running for president, you had Hiram running for the state legislature and was sure to win.
And William had beat
Mhm.
Thomas Sharp of Warsaw for the state
Yeah.
legislature. So here the family clearly had influenced the politics of the region in a way that justified Thomas Sharp and his writings to wipe out this threat. So
Yeah.
it begins to come together and make some sense.
Yes.
Anyway, I wanted to express my appreciation to you. Clearly, the other members of the group are doing the same, but it is gratifying as I look back upon the years I've investigated in Joseph Smith. David has worked with me on a number of those projects, and a few others of you have too. But the fact is, the artifacts, and I showed one artifact that we found that had Joseph and Emma's name on it from 1842 on a porcelain mug.
Oh, wow.
That was in the prayer. The idea that we've gotten personally acquainted with this character is something that artifacts allow a very unique and special insight into. And so I want to encourage our people not to be stuck just on historians, because historians commonly tell the story that their audience wants to hear. The artifacts tell the truth.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's neat. That's really neat.
Thanks, Paul.
Oh, excuse me. The reason I hit the button was my wife nudged me that we should ask you to explore more about the conspiracies. The Book of Mormon speaks about conspiracies, and here in your book you've clearly identified Brigham and Wilford and Parley and William Clayton as being co-conspirators to modify the history. I want to make sure that connection got made this evening.
Yes. Yeah, that's a dirty word, right? Like there's the conspiracy theorists, right? They've turned that into like in our modern world that's your flat earthers and your tunnels under the ocean to China kind of stuff, right? But you're exactly right. The Book of Mormon talks about secret combinations and they're to get gain and to get power, right? And so really one of my kind of life mottos is if they've got power and they've got money, they're getting money from you and they've got power over you, then you really ought to question what they're telling you. And so, yeah, for sure there was, this is kind of a dirty word to say conspiracy. I think God is extremely gracious and merciful and kind, but definitely for whatever motivation, Brigham and Heber and John Taylor and Willard Richards, whatever their motivation was to place polygamy on Joseph's shoulders, it has lasted till today, and it has caused a lot of heartache and a lot of sorrow and a lot of damage to the souls of men. And so, we need to be really careful that what we speak is truth.
Thank you. Paul,
Thank-
were you finished?
Thank you for speaking truth to us.
Well, I hope it's truth. I think it is. I believe it's truth, but I know a lot of people don't agree with me, but I appreciate you guys for listening.
Okay. Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you again. I've got a couple of comments and maybe ask for a response on a couple of things. Have you ever heard about the missing edition of the Times and Seasons?
So it's interesting to me. I don't know where the idea came that it was missing. So let me explain.
Okay.
So I know people today have asked me, and they've shown me that there is in the chronology of the Times and Seasons, it appears that there is a missing edition. But you have to understand, John Taylor was the editor. He had been wounded in Carthage. They've just lost Joseph and Hiram. So it could be a simple explanation of there was just nobody to print it. Like, they're mourning Joseph and Hiram's death. John Taylor's trying to recover. They're also at the very beginning of the Times and Seasons. They did not publish it twice a month. It was a monthly at first. So it's possible that there's a simple explanation. But it's also possible that there really is a missing edition.
Well, the only problem with the first answer that you gave is that the missing edition was on June 15th, 1844, not after Joseph's death.
True.
And guess who was the editor? It was John Taylor. He was in the same room with Joseph.
Yeah.
When the murder took place.
Yeah,
Well,
that's interesting. Well, it's really fascinating to me. So that is, I would love if somebody somewhere is cleaning out.
Yeah, right.
Their grandma's.
I will tell you this. I have a testimony about someone who saw it.
Really? So
yes.
So
and in that,
yes,
well, I can share it with you if you want to take the time.
I want to hear it.
I can give the name and of the people that were involved. I have it recorded by the person who heard it from the person who saw it. This was used to be one of our presidents of 70, Wayne Simmons, who was working in Western Illinois at the time. And he was staying in the home of Brother Raymond Troyer. Now, Luke Troyer was another one of the presidents of 70 at that time in the RLDS church. Raymond Troyer held the chair for history, I believe, at Carbondale University. And one day they got home together and Raymond Troyer asked him to come down to his office, and they wanted to talk with him, and he shared with him about how he was working in the rare book stacks in the University of Chicago years before when he was working on his degree. And he was perusing the Times and Seasons. There were rare books at that time, and he knew that there was an edition that was missing, and he was going through the book, and I actually found the June 15th edition, and it had an article in it with two columns. And the left column was a statement by Joseph Smith saying that there were men in high places in the church who were about to be brought to trial, similar to what the president of the Nauvoo stake said was going to happen. If in fact, Joseph told him to call a meeting of the High Council, and that he was going to bring charges against him. Well, this one says he's going to do it publicly. And then the second column was an article by Hiram Smith, and that was basically to tell what the law of the church was, which was monogamy. And he quoted, Jacob chapter 2 and section 43 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and that's our section of it, giving the law, and also the section that was a resolution at the end of the 1835 edition, saying that we believe in monogamy, basically. And he got so excited, he went home and he told his wife about it. And they decided that they were going to call Israel A. Smith, who was the president of the church. He did. They called down at his office and made an appointment to see him on the next day. He rode the train that night to go down and talk with Israel A. Israel A. told him, well, we have a family tradition in our family that it was an inside job, the murder was. And I've heard that from at least one other member of the Smith family who told me the same thing, Lynn Smith. He was a patriarch in the RLDS church. He was the son of Albert A. Smith. Then Israel A. told him, you go back to Chicago and call a press conference and make this public, and I'll come up and I'll make a public statement about it myself. He went back and the book was missing. And he said, I did what they tell you to do, you know, in the rare book stacks. You don't try to put books back on your own, you leave them out, and the librarian is supposed to put them back where they belong. So that edition apparently disappeared. So, you know, where I have heard of one other person who claims to have seen it. I believe that there probably were a number of them. I have the recording that I have has some ideas about how this might have happened and why. But, you know, if assuming this is true, the articles were brought to John Taylor, who would have been one of the men that was going to be excommunicated immediately. He realized, oh my, we got to do something about this. And so they met together and they decided, well, better that one or two men die than we lose all of our our position here. And so they eliminated him. I know it's speculation on our part, but that's based on testimony of men that I know and trust, have known and trust. I've known them all my life, basically. I wasn't planning on sharing all that with you, but it's something that probably needs to be brought out a little more in the public. We believe that there's probably more editions that actually got out and may exist someplace. And if they exist any place, they probably exist in the hierarchy vaults out in Salt Lake. They've been collected up and, you know, put away. Anyway.
I would love to find that.
Oh, so would I. I know that several people have gone around and looked for these in libraries all over, you know, in England and all over the United States. By the way, one of the other stories that goes along with this is that no one has ever really found any physical evidence that Brigham Young was in Boston when he heard about the death of Joseph. And I have recorded testimony from a person who claims that when in his youth, there was an old lady who would get up and tell the same testimony at prayer service every night, that her grandparents were in Nauvoo when Joseph was killed, and they saw Brigham Young in Nauvoo. And the lady who saw him was threatened and said, sister, you need to just go back to bed and forget that you ever saw me. The interest, I've got that recorded by two different people, really. But anyway, that, and I find it interesting that Karen, in his exoneration of Emma, Joseph, and Hiram, have come to a similar conclusion that Joseph never really ran for presidency, that was a fabricated story to get them out of town. It was fabricated after the death of Joseph to make it look like Joseph was being that was Brigham was in Boston.
Oh, gotcha.
The fact is that here's a prophet of the Lord who is running for the presidency of the United States, and he is an apostle of the Lord is campaigning for him, and yet there's no news in any newspaper in Boston or any place else around there where they were supposedly campaigning for Joseph. You'd think it'd be a newsworthy item, but there's no evidence in any newspaper that Joseph was ever doing that, from what I have been able to find so far.
Interesting.
One last statement is that if you've read Joseph Smith III's memoirs, he states that he heard his father when he came out of the town council meeting where they had voted to destroy the press. He said, I heard my father say, gentlemen, you will rue the day that you have made this decision. And he believed that that was regarding the destruction of the press, that he was against it, and the town council was the one was the part that actually voted to do that in opposition to what Joseph Smith himself wanted.
Yeah.
And of course, he was the mayor and he was leading it, but they overruled him. So thank you again very much for your
Very tragic.
your research. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciated your comments. Those are very interesting.
I'd like to add to that, if I may, the campaign for President of the United States being conducted by the Council of 50 has a very interesting conflict within the notes that we have on it.
Really?
It includes the Constitution drafted for the Kingdom of God. And in the Constitution for the Kingdom of God, Joseph Smith is clearly identified as the prophet, the leader, the one who should select the judges, and and he is to implement the kingdom of God on earth. But here he is running for president of the United States under a constitution that requires more democracy. However, the democracy at that time in the United States was quite different from what we have today, and the effort that the Council of 50 made, we had clear historical evidence of over 300 of the elders leaving Nauvoo, most of them going through the mansion house to go out on their mission to both proselytize for the church and speak for Joseph Smith as candidate for president. And so in that early 1844 period, before he was killed, we do have some very interesting tugs and pulls going on. To what extent was he actually advocating for the Constitution of the United States, and to what extent was he advocating for the kingdom of God? And I find that a fascinating tidbit that's hiding there in the mansion house that I think needs further exploration.
Paul, can I ask this? Was that material that you just quoted written and published during the lifetime of Joseph? I like to go back, and I do the same thing that Sister Whitney has done, and Brother Ron Smith's dad used to do the same thing. He says, I only trust the things that were written and published during Joseph's lifetime.
Yeah.
When they're published afterwards, there can be all kinds of changes made. And I would, I'm interested in what you have to say, and it is an interesting idea about the politics that would have happened, like Whitney said, had Joseph Smith's platform been used to sell public lands, to pay for the slaves and free the slaves, et cetera. That would have changed America greatly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Spencer McBride's book on Joseph Smith's campaign for the presidency is the most recent source that I read, and he will be back next week, I think, to give us some
Okay.
positive review. So he may be the appropriate person to ask on that question. Again, the extent to which the scribes were writing after the fact, and we know that they were doing some of that, and the extent to which they were writing a journal that was effective at the time, I'm reasonably confident that this was at the right time because, for example, we have 3 different documents that speak of I believe it's William Law's daughter being sick, and Joseph and 3 or 4 other gentlemen meet in the mansion house to pray for her. And those 3 different documents, one of them is the minutes of the Council of 50, I believe. Another is in the church history, and a third is in Joseph's journal. All 3 of those documents make it very clear it's the same date, but they all have it in different rooms. So many times when I'm looking at issues on the mansion house, there will only be 1 room reference, but here I find that 3 different documents are citing 3 different rooms for the same event. Therefore, to what extent can you trust the historical documents?
Sounds to me like they were written afterwards.
Well, I recognize there's some conflict there, and clearly the church history was written afterward. But I think Clayton in his journaling was often writing afterwards.
He modified it very heavily too. Yeah.
And yeah, that is suspicious. But my point is that we do have historical documents that appear to have been written at the time, but they're in conflict.
Wow, we've taken a long time tonight, Paul.
Nobody in the queue, Paul.
Here we are, 10:30 plus.
My goodness. This is one of the longest ones we've had.
Well, last week we were longer than this.
Really?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed last week, so I apologize, but I can only do so many things.
But again, Whitney, you have really raised a lot of interest, and it's clear. But Bruce is still on, and I'd like to invite him to respond because he presented earlier advocating that Joseph Smith was involved in polygamy, and he's been very quietly sitting in his library. And Bruce Van Horton, if I can get you to unmute and make a comment, I think it'd be most welcome.
Well, there are a lot of complications. I think Whitney made a few mistakes along the way, and of course that's just how differences take place. She said that there were no contemporary accounts. People have been attacking William Clayton this evening, but William Clayton was a contemporary both with the Council of 50 and events that involved other marriages. And I don't discount what the other people were participating in and stated starting in 1869 with those affidavits. And my association with W.W. Phelps has him knowing very well what Joseph Smith knew about plural marriage dating back to 1831, and also even in 1843 and 1844, he was connected there too. So my evidence is that he did know about it and that they did participate. That's my side of it.
Thank you. There's room in our forum for diverse opinions, and I appreciate that we can have those expressed without acrimony. And if there are other views to be expressed, the floor is still open. Ask me, you've been watching from, what is it, 5 o'clock in the morning in Belgium?
My goodness, yeah. He's really diligent to be here with us.
Now it's 5:40 a.m.
Did you get up early or did you stay up late?
Oh, well, I normally sleep about 4 hours during a 24-hour day. That's all.
The early bird gets the Book of Mormon for him.
Yeah, that's impressive. That was impressive.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is late enough that I think unless you have more questions and comments, we should probably turn it off. I would pause just for another moment in case you do have.
Yes.
Robert indicated that I was to sing you off, and so I will. Good night. The Lord is watching o'er you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you. Good night.
Thanks,
Buenas noches.
Whitney.
Muchas gracias.
De nada.
Good night.